Notes for 7C.5. Now this goes with the notes paper and it goes along with the worksheet. There are 2 assignments for 7.5 in the packet that Mr. Promo assigns. There's a 7.5 notes page and there's a 7.5's worksheet. So make sure you understand this is for both. I'm going to be using the notes page as my examples, and so we'll do those in just a moment. What we have are the basic equations for sine and cosine. A sine of bx, a cosine of bx, and the a is how we figure out what the amplitude is, the absolute value of a, of course. They're going to be asking you to create some equations, and so if you don't know how this translates into the equation, then you're not going to know how to write the equation. B, on the other hand, is how many periods fit into 2 pi radians, and so we use these 2 formulas where the period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. Or if I do a little bit of math to that, if I times by b, b and b would go away. If I divide by p, what you would get is that b is equal to 2 pi over p, which is our second equation. This helps a lot of times, just knowing I can switch these 2 things, which goes along with what we talked about with proportions. You can switch the extremes and you still have a proportion. So with that being said, using these concepts, we're going to be able to answer the questions that are on the notes page, numbers 2, 4, 5, and 6 on the note page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take number 2 right here. I'm going to turn this little light on. I need to do a cosine curve with an amplitude of 1. If it's a cosine curve and the amplitude is 1, I know that A has to be equal to 1. And if the period is pi over 2, I need to figure out what the B value is. So I'm going to use that formula. Which formula? The one that we just talked about. The B value is 2 pi divided by whatever the period says it needs to be. Don't get lost here. When you reduce, don't forget this is 2 divided by 1/2. 2 divided by 1/2 is the same thing as 2 times by the reciprocal. If you ever see something like this where you have 2 over 1/2 or and those pi's reduced and you still have a 1 there, the 2 multiplies that 2 and becomes 4. Your B value is 4. If you know your A and you know your B, you can write the equation. It's a cosine curve. Y equals, do I have to write the 1? No. Cosine of 4x. This is what multiplies the x. We're putting this into the form of y equals something cosine bx, just like we wrote down in the notes. That was number 2. Let's do number 4 next. This gets a little bit harder. A secant curve with asymptotes at pi over 3 and at pi. With a y-intercept of 0, 2. So here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to draw a secant curve for you real quick based off of cosine. The y-intercept at 0, 2. And it has to have asymptotes at pi over 3. Secant is based off of cosine. So I'm thinking it goes like that and like that at this point. I got a 2 and a negative 2. I kind of know what the A value is at this point. I have a feeling that A is going to be 2 just based off of that information right there. But then it tells me that it has asymptotes at pi over 3. So let me just draw a little dotted. Here's a pi over 3. And that's got to be a quarter of the way. This is 2 pi over 3. And then this must be 3 pi over 3. 3 pi over 3 must be pi. So that matches up. That matches up. Let's go one more quartile. 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3. This must be 4 pi over 3. So I know my period is 4 pi over 3. And that's not the B value. If I want to know what the B value is, I use my formula 2 pi divided by B. Got a fraction over a fraction. I got to be careful here. Pi divided by pi. 2 divided by 2 divided by 2. 1 divided by 2/3. 1 divided by 2/3 is 1 times by 3 over 2. My B must be 3 over 2. So that means my equation must be y equals my amplitude times the secant of 3/2 x. There's my answer. Number 5. Write an equation for the trig function with the given graph. The first thing I check is this value and this value. It lets me know that A has to be which value. The second thing that I do is I look at this. Where does it touch the y-axis? It touches right here at the midline. It goes midline, extrema, midline, extrema, midline. I'm looking at this period. And I know which trig function it has to be that I'm using. Which trig function does it have to be? Hoping you're thinking it's sine of x. Then it starts midline, extrema, midline, extrema, midline, and it ends right here at how many radians? I've circled it, pi. That means my period has to be 2 pi divided by b. I know what that is. I'm going to switch these two things. B is equal to 2 pi divided by pi. I know what my b value has to be now. B has to be 2. And now you have all the information you need to write this equation. I don't have to write the 1. Sine of 2x. Matter of fact, I actually prefer you not to write the 1 there because then it's more simplified. But it's an implied 1. Lastly, number 6. I'm looking at this graph. I see an amplitude, and that looks like a 1, and that looks like a negative 1. I know my A has to be 1. I see a bunch of U's, so it's either secant or cosecant, but maybe I'm stuck, and I don't know which one is which. So I'm going to draw this for you. I'm going to draw, there's an asymptote here. There's an asymptote right there. So there must be some function that goes through that equals 0 here, touches at the very bottom of the U shape there, and touches right there at that intercept. And so I'm seeing this dotted parent graph. It must be related to this cousin somehow. And I'm hoping you see it. That is based off of cosine. Cosine is the reciprocal to which one? I'm hoping you thought of secant. Now, this secant graph, or this cosine, does it start at the positive extrema or the negative extrema? So that must mean that our A value is actually -1. So I'm going to cross that one off that we just had there. Originally, I thought it was 1, but because we're starting at the negative extrema, it must mean that my A value is a negative 1. My amplitude is still positive 1 because the amplitude's always based off of is always a positive distance, but our equation might be negative. So the last thing I need to figure out is this period, the B value. The B value is 2 pi divided by the period. And so I'm just going to simplify this. And I know that the B value has to be pi over 3. So what I have is y equals negative secant of pi over 3 x. And that's what I get. Here are your notes for the notes page. You are going to do that and everything that you see here on 7C5.